Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I hope you're seated comfortably and have your coffees and teas. And is that better? Is that better? Okay, fabulous. So we've just moved to the new office here at 4 Millbank. So I'm Jodie Keane. I'm a Principal Research Fellow within the International Economic Development Group at ODI Global. Is the sound okay or it's not okay? Reverb. Okay, I'm not too sure how to resolve that. If I kind of keep talking and I'll sort it out. Okay, thank you, Karen. So good morning, everyone. So we're really delighted to welcome you all here to our conference on geoeconomics. Before I get into what that term is all about, I do want to extend my thanks and appreciation to the whole team that's made this conference happen here today. We do have quite a packed agenda to run through if you're with us for the whole day. I hope you are. So I trust that you're all seated comfortably and settled. And just in terms of housekeeping, if you do hear a fire alarm, it is the real deal. So just keep calm, but we will have to evacuate the building. Can I please ask that your mobile phones are kept off, please, so that we don't get disrupted during the discussions. And then just in terms of the setup, we'll begin shortly with our keynote address from Sir Vincent Cable, and then we'll move to our first panel session with our distinguished guests and speakers before we break for our coffee and other refreshments. And we've deliberately scheduled the conference today so that we have lots of breaks for refreshments. So we do want to keep you happy and hydrated. And we also have drinks after the session today because it's really easy to feel quite down and depressed at the moment. I know. Well, we keep hydrated and see how it goes. So, I know many of you have just traveled back. You're back from Geneva. So, you're very much aware of all of the repercussions of Trump 2.0 and the conversations. Some people are saying if we look ahead to MC14, if nothing much happens, that's actually quite a good outcome for some. We see overt protectionism, the wielding of tariffs to support industrial and other policy goals, napkin deal-making, the domestic politics, violence, global security concerns. So it's very easy to get quite down at the moment. We know that many of the kind of combined effects bear so many resemblances to the 1930s, and we really thought that we'd managed to avoid that risk since the global financial crisis. But here we are in 2025, and the outlook on global growth is looking set for the weakest run since 2008 and the Great Depression. However, many of you also come from other regions and parts of the world where the outlook is actually more optimistic and more positive. New regional trade and industrial policy frameworks are being implemented, including engaging with new issues at the crux of the fourth industrial revolution, digitalization, green industrialization, and so on. And of course, for many countries and regions, the deployment of different types of industrial policy tools embedded within trade and innovation strategies have always been part of their broader socio-economic development strategies. There's been less of a relegation to the government as a solver of market failures, but more of a market shaper. So we've always known that these distinctions between the state and market roles and responsibilities, they're quite hard to delineate. But nowadays, new approaches towards trade and development, trade and investment, trade and industrial policy, commercial diplomacy, they're all far less visibly constrained by neoliberal orthodoxy, the Washington consensus. So as all major players seek to balance different interests and use public policy instruments to advance different policy goals, some like climate change, this is a global public policy concern. Some perceive this as actually being a period of great opportunity. We now have aspects of mission-orientated government across the board, and we can move away from the kind of neoclassical approaches that have constrained our approaches to trade and industrial policy for so long. This is the view of some. So what we've tried to do today in this conference is make sure that we're bringing together different views and different perspectives from different regions, from different stakeholders, and we've really tried to couch this conference within a kind of pluralist setting. So this is the way in which we've structured the conversation so that we can look at the regions first and different country experiences first before we then move to the actual specific areas of interest, economic security and sustainability. So I think I'll stop there and pass to Ganesh for a few words before we then move to our keynote. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'd like to give you all an excellent welcome to this session this morning, and like to add 3 points to what Jody has said to us, which frames this conference. The first is really about the speed. You know, the speed at which unilateral protectionism has come about is dazzling. Compare September to this now to a year ago. The world has changed. Second, on preparedness, developing countries, particularly least developed countries, small states and indebted nations with less capacity and capital, if you like, are in a particularly vulnerable situation. And we are seeing varied responses across the developing world to this new paradigm. And I hope today we will get some more of that. The third point is research. One hopes that this conference stimulates some thinking, perhaps old and new, because I think that's the way we're going to have to go, on not just trade and industrial policy, but also economic diplomacy, which I think is going to be terribly important in framing a broader engagement of these different sets of countries that are going to come. And I hope ODI can frame this conversation a bit through research and engagement and also ground-level advice. It's now time to welcome Sir Vince as our keynote speaker this morning. Sir Vince needs really no introduction. He is a distinguished, he's the distinguished fellow at ODI, and he began his career at ODI 60 years ago, he was telling me this morning. And I remember meeting him when he was chief economist of Shell and talking about scenario planning a long time ago. And I think that's particularly apt today. And then he went on to the Commonwealth Secretariat, where he advised developing countries, I think also with Sheila at that time, if I remember, or around that time. And then he went on to many other roles, including a government minister of business, if I remember right, and also leader of the Liberal Party. So we are really honored to have you here. And he's going to talk to us today about his new book, Eclipsing the West, China, India, and Forging of the New World, which is a very fitting entry point for this conference. Thank you very much, Sir Vince. Please join me in giving Vince a big hand to give his keynote. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. First of all, a little bit of self-promotion, if I might. Came out last week. It's a slightly long-winded title, but actually geoeconomics is actually a better, in a way, a pithier description of what I'm trying to do in this book. But let me start with a chart that actually explains the title, you know, what the eclipsing of the West actually means. Basically, I've just taken here IMF numbers, GDP, purchasing power, parity-based, and the purple line is what you might call the developed world, advanced industrial economies, of course includes Japan, now Singapore and others. The green line is emerging and developing economies. Red line is emerging Asia, and yellow is China plus India. It's mainly China at the moment. And it's very striking, as you see, there's sort of a crossover point at the beginning of the century and a widening gap. Now, you might say, why would this go on forever? You know, it might well not. You know, we're in a new world. All this protectionism, of course, may just change the assumptions on which this trend is based. But the current momentum is actually sustaining that. I mean, if you take the US, which is by far the most dynamic country in the developed economies, powered by the AI boom. Was it 2.5% growth, something like that? Europe's 1.5%, Japan about the same, UK. And in the emerging markets, India is now 6 or 7% growth. China is said to be 5%. We know that the Chinese have a funny way with statistics, but it can't be exaggerated all that much. Southeast Asia, certainly 5% plus, and Africa, despite all the many problems, growing actually quite rapidly. So the underlying trends are to sustain this divergent, where effectively the center of gravity of the world economy is moving to the south. Now, I developed several chapters to talking about that, but this is an enormous leap to what the world could look like. And of course, there are many, we can't predict the future, all kind of stuff could happen. But what I chose the central forecast of the OECD, which I assumed was reasonably plausible and not had any obvious political bias. It's a sort of central focus they use in their climate modeling. And it's a bit out of date, and maybe all these numbers are now less. But the blue line is quite an interesting picture of what the world plausibly could look like in 25 years' time. And, I don't know what you think about it, but it seems fairly sensible to me. China is already #1 in purchasing power parity terms, and that differential will probably grow despite the current problems of the Chinese economy. If you think about it, it's got 4 times the population of the US. Even then, it will have half the per capita income of the United States, which is a fairly modest assumption, I think. What really is striking and shocked my Chinese audiences when I presented this to them a couple of weeks ago in Shenzhen was the India title, because on reasonably plausible assumptions about Indian economic growth, it finishes up as the second biggest economy in the world by the middle of the century. And I say, plausible, not extreme assumptions. And really, this is the power of compound interest rates. And that's where you finished up. The Chinese found this much harder to understand than the Americans I presented this to, because most of the Chinese academics and policy people I've talked to tend to think of the Indian subcontinent as a messy, dirty place. And the concept of functioning anarchy, which is a good description of India, I think, is something they can't get their heads around. So the idea that India could be a serious geo-economic competitor within a generation, it was something they find very challenging. And further at the other end of the table, of course, the 4th biggest economy in the world by then, and rapidly becoming already, is Indonesia. It's a country we tend not to think very much about. And this has, so I'm making an enormous jump here. I have a big section in the book. I talk about economic security, and I sort of raid the literature on all this stuff about the Thucydides trap, which is something Chinese policy people spend an awful lot of time worrying about. I guess most of you are reasonably familiar with this. This is the idea going back to Athens and Sparta that the cheeky, up-and-coming, I can't remember if it's Athens or Sparta. My knowledge of ancient history is probably a bit ropey, but one of them challenged the other and it led to war. And the current theory, which people like Allison, the geopolitics guru in the US, have been advocating, is that the China-US competition is bound to lead to conflict. And I think he cited 16 examples throughout history where this process resulted in conflict, with 2 exceptions. Two cases of accommodation. The British very gentlemanly stepped aside for the Americans without fighting. The Portuguese didn't seem to mind being overtaken by Spain. And of course, during the Cold War, never actually became hot, but all other cases have led to conflict. So the point I emphasize in the book is that there are 2 traps. There isn't just one. The other is the economic historian Kindleberger, who basically argued that if you get a declining superpower, no longer exercising authority over the international system, and you get a rising power which isn't capable or all that interested, you get a collapse in the management of what you could call the global commons. And I think we're all reasonably familiar with what some of those global commons are. The idea that you have a system of international law governing trade in standard setting, environment, climate, of course, is a big issue for the ODI, economic coordination. I mean, it is, back in 2008, one of the big events that took place was in London when Gordon Brown got together not just the G7 countries, but the Chinese, and agreed a common response to the global crisis. Very difficult to see that happening now. Global health and pandemics, peacekeeping, proliferation, humanitarian assistance, the role of the UN. And the question is, if you no longer have a global superpower which is interested in supporting these different common activities, what happens to them? Well, that's the big unanswered question. So I've tried to pose the Thucydides trap in the following way: that you have elements of competition, manufacturing, where the Chinese are now very clearly the dominant power. Their share of world manufacturing is about 30%. So over in output terms, a bit less in value added, but about coming up to a third. The US is now about half that, which of course is what MAGA is all about, and Trump protectionism. The US still has, I'll talk through these in a little bit more detail at the moment, dominance in terms of currency use, which affects your ability to borrow in your own currency fundamentally. Technology, where I'll come back to that in more detail. And then you need to think also about the military and soft power, where I think we assume by and large that the US is still dominant, but after Trump, who knows? And I've taken one of these because we're short of time. This is highly impressionistic. There is absolutely no scientific basis for this whatever, but I've tried on the basis of looking through scientific journals and to roughly indicate the relative position of the two superpowers, blue being the US, red being China. And there are some areas where it's still very clear the US has a technical lead. The big arguments about chip wars, you're probably very familiar with, but certainly within the last year, it's emerged that Chinese companies under government support have got all kind of workarounds to the export controls, and the gap now is not all that great. The most topical issue of all, which is in terms of language models, again, it was assumed the US was way ahead until the emergence of DeepSeek, and I think there have been 3 or 4 different models that have emerged in the last few months, which have developed the DeepSeek competence in China. We don't know. Dan Wang, who I think is probably one of the best writers on this subject, thinks the Chinese are broadly about 6 months behind. But with some of the havoc that Trump is causing, that gap might close quite quickly. Green energy, where in almost every respect, the Chinese technology is way ahead. Wind power, wind, sun, and the supply chains, which are crucial. Nuclear power, where almost all the new nuclear plants are Chinese now. Telecoms, certainly where Chinese technology is well ahead, I would guess, through 6G. All the rather complicated history in Britain of our dealings with Huawei have got to link into all of this. Quantum physics, where I have a family interest. My son is one of the people trying to develop American quantum lead in Silicon Valley, about its different models. Quantum is an interesting area if you want to see different. The American route through Silicon Valley is very bottom up. The Chinese got the best quantum physicist that they could find about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they gave him infinite resources. So they've got this wonderful system developed in China where from virtually zero have built up comparable competence to the leading quantum companies in the US and so on. I don't want to dwell in detail, but this is clearly where a lot of the arguments are currently going on. This is the other big battleground. It matters not just because the US has a great deal of economic freedom from being able to basically print its own money and get the rest of the world to buy up dollar assets, but also its ability to stymie other countries by blocking their use of dollar-based transaction systems. And you see that the dollar is pretty dominant in all of these things. Within the last 2 or 3 years, things have moved very quickly. Following the sanctions on Russia, the Chinese realized that they're next in line and they got themselves organized very quickly. There is a system based on China, the United Arab Emirates, Thailand, I think. It's a rather peculiar combination of countries which has developed a model for circumventing currency interventions. The Indians are also developing quite a lot of rupee trade, not just with Russia, but with the Middle East. And you're beginning to see a concerted effort to try and break this stranglehold. Now, what does all this lead to in terms of international structures? And this is one attempt I made to try and characterize it in a chart. And this is the view that although we still have these apex bodies, the UN is now virtually defunct. The WTO are much the same. You still have the G20, but nobody really pays much attention to it. So if anything is functioning at all, it's the G7, the old developed countries still functioning as a group. And at a much more embryonic level, the BRICS countries, it is more rhetoric than anything else, but it is a statement that the countries of the global south, or at least the more powerful ones, should get organized and are getting organized. But it's very messy, and there's quite a lot of overlap. I mean, one of the interesting ones is the CGTPP, which is a nation construct, which Britain has decided to join. Britain has declared itself to be a nation country. It's puzzling to some of us, but there it is. And the RCEP group in Southeast Asia, which Japan is a member of. So there's some overlap. And I thought because the degree of messiness is so great, I recast it with a different kind of world map. And you see, if you look hard enough, you've still got the G7 there in orange. And you've still got the BRICS group, which is in blue at the other side. But there's an awful lot of overlapping networks. And this is mainly trade, but some of these groupings have a sort of security, military function. One of the more interesting ones is the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, basically Chinese, but they've co-opted India because they do have a common interest in territorial integrity, crushing secessionist movements and terrorism, and others. Some are specifically regional groups like Mercosur, which do function after a fashion. The ASEAN group, which is probably with the European Union the longest standing regional group, it's really loose. And although I found it difficult to fit within all the other boxes, I put the RCEP, which is essentially a nation trade group with Chinese membership. And that was the reason the Indians didn't want to join it, because they thought Indian industry would be swept away by Chinese competition. But anyway, the message here, it's all complicated, it's all very messy, but there are lots of overlapping networks emerging from this network world. And the last chapter in my book is an attempt to try to employ my now rather aging scenario planning skills to thinking about the future. And those of you who've ever been involved in scenario planning will know that it's attempts to look at the future, which are not predictions. You know, you're not predicting the future. You're trying to think about what is logical, given where we are, and what is plausible, and how you might respond to it. So, there's a lot of description in the book, and I've quantified some of this with the range of economic numbers. But I think it's quite useful to think about three possible ways that the world is now evolving. And each of these elements are there at the present. And one or the other might well become dominant over time. And at the top, I've got the global West, this idea, which was certainly very prominent when people like Sullivan were guiding security policy in the United States in the Biden administration, that the West effectively co-opts the leading countries of the South, notably India. You know, India is brought in because of its security concerns vis-a-vis China. And that's sort of happening. I mean, I was in India at Christmas talking to a lot of their think tanks, and the antipathy to China was sort of palpable. And it's already, you know, whether you're BGP or Congress, there is this, I think, underlying assumption that China is the big bad wolf at the door. And, you know, you may not like the Americans and the Europeans, but, you know, we ultimately depend on them. And that kind of thinking was prevalent to the Trump administration. And the big question now is whether Trump's clumsiness, you know, with the tariffs, the cuddling up to General Munir, because he's suggested that Trump would be a good recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, whether that actually constitutes a change or whether it's just a little ripple on a much bigger pool. So there is this concept of the global West, where effectively the West dominates, co-opts India, maybe Brazil, Saudi, of course, against the big bad enemy, the axis of evil, you know, China, Russia, Korea, and so on. And I think if you'd been thinking about the world 6 months ago, whether your likes and dislikes, that looked as if the way where we're all going. But you know, we're now into a sort of a somewhat different world, and what I call the BRICS Plus, where India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the other big players in the global South actually decline to be co-opted and decide they want to go their own way by, you know, their own alliances and doing their own thing. Sometimes called a multipolar world, where there are big spheres of influence, clearly Russia in its periphery, China in its periphery, the US with its new Monroe Doctrine, and so on. And that begins to look more and more plausible. The problem with the multipolar world is that it's quite attractive. You're a global South diplomat, but the problem is who actually is responsible for the global commons in this world? Because this is a world which is effectively fragmenting, and there is no global overview. And unless by coincidence people decide that they'd like to deal with global warming, nobody's basically leading it. And that leads to a third option, which I call a vortex, a downward spiral, where fragmentation feeds on itself. This is very much a kind of Trump world where international institutions, World Trade Organization, COP, you know, just implode because there's basically Americans pull out of them. And you get into a downward spiral of localized conflicts that become bigger conflicts and so on. And at some point, you know, disaster happens. It could happen in many ways. And maybe if you're a true optimist, you think that some kind of new order emerges from the debris. So that's something to think about. And that's how my book finishes. But essentially, what I'm trying to get people to do is to think about what the new world order, if it is an order, looks like emerging from these trends. But thank you very much for listening.